Ari Rosenbaum here with another fun-filled episode of that 401k podcast. This week's topic, we're going to talk about 401k plans. It's supposed to be an employee benefit, right? Something that I've always been saying for plan sponsors, never forget that a 401k plan is a benefit for employees. And of course, first things first, go to that 401ksite.com, sign up, National Virtual Conference coming up at the end of January, and then we'll have the dates for 2025. I actually did get a call a couple days ago while building my Sukkah, because the holiday of Sukkot, by the time this episode drops, will be near the end of the holiday. But I got a call from the Washington Nationals and trying to hopefully maybe have a conference there in September. I think we are going to go definitely with Chicago, Denver, and Philly. And if we get some interest for Washington, D.C., we'll probably do that. And of course, got some articles, all that kind of stuff if you go to that 401ksite.com. And again, the National Virtual Conference is gratis. It's free. This is like the 6th edition, I want to say, of it. And I think in the beginning we charged. And if you are a plan provider and you want to be a part of it, it's free. All you got to do is just come in and sponsor one of the live events that we're going to have in 2026. So let's get to the topic at hand. I always joke that the reason I never hired an employee is because I was one too. I was a malcontent. I use that line that David Geffen said about Don Henley in the History of the Eagles documentary. And I think it was a chapter in the last book, Full Circle, which is still available in paperback, in Kindle, on Amazon.com. I was a malcontent. I'm always going to be a malcontent, and that's okay. But I think that I had a right to be a malcontent because, I had a lot of bad luck working for people who didn't appreciate me. Worse, didn't appreciate, clients, didn't appreciate fellow coworkers and all that kind of stuff. And I had the belief that, if you don't value the people who rely on you, whether they're employees or clients, you're building your business on sand. And, I once worked for a TPA, that they switched, they switched, the platform on me. Didn't do a very good job of notifying the plan participants, but more importantly, they switched us from a really great platform that I liked. One of the top mutual fund companies in this country, and they switched it to an insurance-based platform. And the only reason they did it was, to save the pricing on the insurance-based platform. So they were doing a lot of business with, the cheaper platforms that we had. And we weren't running a lot of business for the insurance company. So to save our premier pricing, they took our $4 million 401k plan, moved it over. And I was not happy. Again, I was a malcontent. I think I had a right to be a malcontent. And the boss was trying to explain to me why this was such a great thing. And I'm like, you know what? I'm not an idiot. There's a reason why we're not running this business on this insurance-based platform. And that insurance-based platform, the companies on that platform were paying, 180 basis points for the platform, not including the advisory fees, not including the investment options and all that kind of stuff. But it all goes back to what I've always said. 401k plan is, supposed to be an employee benefit. And, plan sponsors really need to take participant communication seriously. Need to inform plan participants of all changes, get them involved into the plan. The whole idea is, the 401k plan is supposed to be an employee benefit. So when I worked at that TPA, I've always told the story. The only time people were up in arms was when they stopped providing free milk for the Keurig machine. So when they switched us from, the great mutual fund company to the insurance-based platform, nobody protested except me, of course. But the free milk, that's where they drew the line on. Which just reminds me of the scene in Airplane 2 where, Elaine's telling um, uh, when Elaine tells the crew, I'm sorry, the passengers, we're million miles off course. We're headed towards the sun. Are you telling us the whole truth? And Elaine's like, sorry, we're out of coffee. And that's when the plane explodes in terms of people being angry and fighting and all that, and they start panicking. But when it comes to 401k plans, transparency isn't optional. Too many plan sponsors think of the 401k as something they have to offer rather than a benefit that should work for their employees. To me, the whole purpose of a 401k plan is to recruit and retain employees. And I, over the years that I was working for other people, the 401k plan was a real priority. My wife at that time was working for New York City, so health insurance wasn't the big deal. What really floated my boat, as I said, was a 401k plan. And uh, you know, participants aren't widgets on the assembly line. They're people trying to save for retirement. When you make changes to the platform, record keeper, or investment menu, it impacts their accounts and decisions, sometimes their trust. And once trust is lost, good luck getting it back. If a sponsor changes investment lineup, participants deserve to know why the change is happening, what their options are, when the changes will take effect. Anything less is negligence. And no, hiding behind the fine print of a summary of material modifications doesn't cut it. Participants deserve clear, plain English explanations. Uh, there's an importance of, enrollment education meetings. Too many plan sponsors treat enrollment meetings as a box to check. Back in the old days, plan sponsors would just, they saw enrollment meetings as a waste of time, so they tried to push it off as much as they could, kind of like a appointment with the dentist. I think they've been better with it over the last 15, 20 years, just because of what's going on in the litigation world, and having plan providers that I think are better sophisticated, more educated, better marketers than they were in the past. Uh, you know, enrollment meeting is one of the few touch points employees have to understand the plan. It's a place where myths can be corrected. Like I had that coworker who said he puts in all his money with the mid cap fund because it's the middle of the market. And without it, you're asking participants to navigate one of the most complex financial decisions of their lives with nothing but Google and gut instinct. And a good enrollment meeting is going to cover the basics of participation, which is eligibility, enrollment deadlines, contribution elections, the employer match, if any, investment basics, and how to get help. And here's the kicker: you can't just do that at the plan launch and call it a day. People change jobs, new hires come in, life circumstances shift. Annual or even semi-annual education meetings isn't a luxury; they're a fiduciary best practice. Uh, I have a radical idea. I've always said that sponsors should seek employee input. I don't see many plan sponsors who do that. Ask employees what they want from their 401k plan. Too often, plan design decisions are made in a vacuum by HR, by finance, or by whoever signs the plan documents. But if the plan is for employees, shouldn't they have a voice? I'm not suggesting that they have the control. I'm certainly not saying that. Ultimately, it's the bosses who decide what goes on. You should never, of course, hand fiduciary control to employees. But having surveys, town halls, or even informal feedback sessions can tell you a lot about what your workforce values. I always talk about having a suggestion box. Suggestion box is great because it's anonymous, and you can get honest feedback. Because some employers don't want that honest feedback. Again, working for this TPA, I think I even talked about it last week. I was told that I was bringing morale down because I was suggesting basic concepts that, if you get bought out, there's going to be changes in the business. I mean, that's just basic common sense. But, ask about maybe they want automatic enrollment. Maybe they want Roth contributions. Maybe they want loans if you don't offer it. Investment options. Participants don't get to design the lineup, but if maybe they want ESG funds, which I'm not the biggest fan of, but some businesses are more in tune to be proactive and get ESG funds, while somebody like me, who's kind of right of center, does not. Maybe they want, index funds. But this day and age, I think everybody should be using index funds, in my opinion, but that's just me. The point is you're not really going to turn your employees into the investment committee, but what you are is, trying to get their honest opinion. And communication is fiduciary duty in action. Failing to communicate with participants isn't just bad practice, it's a potential fiduciary breach. ERISA requires plan sponsors to act prudently and in the best interest of participants. We know that. A lot of plan sponsors don't. That doesn't mean you should only pick low-cost funds or hiring a competent record keeper. It also means making sure participants understand the benefit. What good is, a diversified investment menu if participants don't know how to use it? What good is an employer match if employees don't know it exists? Fiduciary duty isn't abstract, it's real, and it's lived out in the day-to-day experience of participants. Again, lessons from that, bad old days, and, trying to save, going back to that TPA that I worked for, just, switching platforms, that wasn't good. And I don't think they understood, even to this day, 15 years after going out of business, I don't think they understood how the way they treated employees, and not informing them of stuff like why we're switching, platforms, that eroded trust. You wanted to get out of there. If you read in Full Circle, I always say when the chief operating officer wants to get you, it's time to leave. But, we were in the benefit business and we had the worst benefits. So the 401k plan switched over from Fidelity. It was Fidelity. I just blurted that out to an insurance company, which I will not name because they're still in the 401k plan business, so that narrows it down. But, forget about that fact. We also had lousy health insurance every year. We're switching over from one HMO to another, and the price goes up, and the quality of services and what's covered and all that goes down. And that's what it was. And I think that plan sponsors need to understand that a lack of communication does a lot of damage. It hurts, and you don't want to lose good employees over stupidity. And for a 401k plan, forget the fact of the stupidity that they leave, but some employees just might not participate in the 401k plan. They complain to HR, and sometimes they sue. We just had a law firm, I forgot the name of it, just recently sued by a former participant, former employee. I was a former associate attorney. He sued because they were holding on to the money and not depositing into the 401k plan on a timely basis. This is what happens. Former employees are more likely to sue than current employees. Communication is the cheapest insurance against participant dissatisfaction and potential litigation. I've always said, and if you read again Full Circle, the worst, most of the relationships that I had end in my life was because of a lack of communication. And obviously the problems with some relationships were, because of lack of communication. I've been happily married for 22 years, but the fighting you have is because of a lack of communication or miscommunication. And communication, to me, is cheap, especially in this day and age with social media and all that. It's important to make the plan a real benefit. If you want to call a 401k plan an employee benefit, then sponsors need to treat it like one. That means being transparent about changes, prioritizing education with, enrollment meetings, and, make sure that the enrollment meetings don't come off like funerals, because I've seen a lot of enrollment meetings that are less livelier than funerals. It's important to solicit feedback. Employees don't run the plan, but their input does matter. And I think that plan sponsors just don't do enough of that. Like I said, the suggestion box, make it anonymous. Let's hear what they have to say. Because a lot of times people, temper themselves. Again, I was malcontent, so I was going to do that. I didn't care. But most employees do care that they don't get singled out, and so they may be more honest if they could do it anonymously. It's important for plan sponsors to remember their fiduciary duty. Communication is part of prudence. A well-run 401k plan helps employees retire with dignity. A poorly run one is just window dressing. If your plan doesn't make employees feel valued and informed, you're missing the point. And the concluding point is, my career taught me what happens when employers and providers forget that employees are the reason a 401k plan exists in the first place. I never hired an employee because I didn't want to become the kind of boss I once worked for. And I probably won't, because, I didn't become the father that I had. And again, that's in full circle. But, I worked for too many people that, they cut corners, they ignored communication, and treated people like afterthoughts. It even goes back to when I was a law clerk when I was going to Boston University Tax LLM, and I worked for a law firm, and it was a litigation / real estate law firm. In those days, as a law clerk, they were paying me $22 an hour, and I thought that was like a lot of money, which happens when you don't have rent and, a family and a car and all that kind of stuff. But I saw it firsthand when they had a paralegal. They were telling her what a great job she was doing at her annual review, and within 2 weeks she got fired. And that really rankled people, and that didn't help them with the other paralegals. We had 2 others. Plan sponsors really don't have a choice. They really have to run their plans without silence. They can't hide behind compliance checklists and the bare minimum disclosures. They need to embrace the reality that a 401k plan is an employee benefit, and benefits only work if employees feel and are actually benefited. It isn't complicated. It's about respect. Respect for participants, respect for their futures, and respect for the trust they put in their employer when they enroll in the plan. After all, if the plan doesn't serve employees, then what's the whole use? And it goes back to not a big fan of Javier Bardem right now with his politics. I saw him at one of these award shows. He dressed up as a terrorist. That's my politics for the day. But he was in No Country for Old Men. He played Anton, and he had if the rule you followed led you to this, what use was the rule? And that's how it's one of my favorite lines of all time. But it's something that I really believe. If this rule of not engaging with your participants, not getting their input, not providing education, if it leads to a plan that is just shoddy, then what's the point? You've really hurt yourself for nothing. Because again, employees are people with feelings. And if they don't like what's going on with the plan, and that's a huge benefit to them, then they may leave you for somebody else who's got a better plan. Benefits again, that gets people excited, and leave and whatnot. But anyway, that's that. And again, go to that 401ksite.com for further information on our events, articles. I always like writing. We have a section on Beyond the 401k where I talk about stuff that has nothing to do with 401k plans. I'll talk about streaming wars. I'll talk about, life. I'll talk about baseball autographs. And tune in next week for another fun-filled episode of that 401k podcast. Take care. Bye.